I never imagined myself as someone whose life could fall apart in a matter of weeks. I thought my life was stable, predictable even. Claire and I had been married for almost a decade, and I genuinely believed we had the perfect balance. She worked at a bustling marketing firm, juggling late nights and occasional business trips, while I took care of our 2 kids and managed my home office. I had complete faith in her. I never questioned where she was or who she was with. It was a random Saturday when the first thread started to unravel. I was cleaning out the garage, a job I'd put off far too long. We'd accumulated an absurd amount of clutter over the years, things we didn't even remember owning. That's when I stumbled upon an old suitcase of Claire's, tucked behind a stack of dusty cardboard boxes. It looked like something she hadn't used in years, and I figured it might be worth sifting through, maybe even find something worth donating. When I unzipped it, a few souvenirs spilled out: keychains, postcards, a miniature Eiffel Tower, and a few magnets with Orlando and Boston stamped on them. It struck me as odd. Claire had never mentioned going to Boston or Orlando on her work trips, and we'd never gone there together. I figured maybe they were from a layover, a quick stop to buy a few souvenirs on the way to her real destination. But something didn't feel right. I brushed off my initial doubt, forcing myself to believe I was overthinking it. But as the days passed, the feeling gnawed at me. The image of those souvenirs lingered, their shiny surfaces almost mocking me. I found myself replaying her stories about her trips, suddenly uncertain of every detail she'd shared. When did she go to Boston? Why didn't she tell me? One night, as I lay awake next to her, I stared at the ceiling, feeling an invisible weight pressing on my chest. I'd always prided myself on being a trusting husband. Claire and I had promised to keep our lives open to each other, to never give each other reason for doubt. And yet, here I was, lying awake with a seed of suspicion growing roots in my mind. I'd never been one to pry into her personal space, and I'd never thought of myself as the jealous type. But that night, my resolve began to weaken. The next morning, Claire left for another work trip, and the house was quiet. I sat in the kitchen with my coffee, staring at her empty seat. My gaze drifted to her phone bill on the counter. She'd left a pile of mail to sort out when she got back. Without giving myself a chance to reconsider, I picked up the bill, my heart racing as if I were doing something wrong. I quickly scanned the numbers, feeling a sense of relief at the familiar ones: her mother, her best friend. But then, one number caught my eye. It had a Virginia area code and was all over the bill, stretching back months. I felt a pang of unease, a tightness in my stomach. Who could she be talking to so often from another state? I reasoned with myself, thinking it could be a work-related contact, someone she frequently collaborated with. But a part of me, the part that had seen those souvenirs, wouldn't let go. I went to my computer, typing the number into an online search tool, hoping it would reveal something simple, a business line, a generic contact. But the results that came up were even more unsettling. The number was flagged as a VoIP number, a virtual phone line that someone could use to stay anonymous. It was becoming harder to ignore my growing suspicions. My head was swimming, and my heart pounded as if I'd just run a mile. I closed the laptop, feeling almost ashamed of myself. Was I really doing this? Searching through her phone bill, piecing together clues as if I were in some detective novel? But something inside me had shifted. I'd opened a door I couldn't close, and now it felt as if the whole house was filling with doubt, pressing in on me from every corner. By the time Claire came back from her trip, I'd managed to shove my suspicions deep enough down to act normal. Or at least, I hoped it seemed that way. But as I watched her talk about her trip, describing a client meeting and a fancy dinner with colleagues, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding back. Her words seemed just a little too rehearsed, her laugh a little too forced. She hugged me like she always did, but I felt a strange sense of distance, as though an invisible barrier had formed between us. For the next few weeks, I tried to ignore the signs, convincing myself that my fears were unfounded. I told myself that there was a logical explanation for everything, that I was letting my mind run wild over nothing. But no matter how hard I tried, the gnawing suspicion wouldn't let go. It grew, fed by every odd look she gave me, every moment of silence that seemed to stretch a little too long. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I decided to test the waters. "Hey, Claire," I began casually, "have you ever been to Boston? I saw some stuff from there in the garage and was just wondering." She froze for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to make my heart race. She quickly recovered, laughing it off. "Oh, that must be from a layover. You know how I love grabbing those little souvenirs." Her explanation was simple, almost too simple, but I nodded, pretending to be satisfied. Inside, however, something snapped. I couldn't keep brushing it off. Claire's layover souvenirs suddenly felt like flimsy excuses, each one a thread in a larger tapestry of deception. My doubts had taken root, and I knew I wouldn't find peace until I uncovered the truth. So that night, after Claire went to bed, I snuck downstairs, opened my laptop, and began searching for more clues. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I finally gathered the courage to open Claire's email. The house was still, the only sounds the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the floorboards. My hands hovered over the keyboard, feeling like they weighed 1,000 pounds. I knew her password, something we'd shared in the early, trusting days of our marriage. It felt like a betrayal, but the need for answers was stronger. My fingers moved before my mind could argue otherwise. I typed in her login, barely breathing as I waited for the page to load. As the screen filled with emails, I scrolled through dozens of work-related messages, client updates, and the usual spam. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was just about to close the laptop when a name caught my eye. Michael. I felt a jolt as I clicked on the first email, bracing myself. The subject line was mundane, client review update, but as I read the contents, my stomach churned. It started innocently enough, a conversation about an upcoming presentation, but the tone shifted with each message, from professional to personal, almost flirtatious. I scrolled further down, following the thread, my chest tightening with each sentence. Then I found the message that shattered the thin wall I'd built to contain my suspicions. "Last night was incredible," Michael wrote. "I can't stop thinking about it. When can we do it again?" My mind went blank, my thoughts crashing into each other like waves in a storm. It was one thing to suspect, to their eyes, but seeing the words, seeing them there on the screen in black and white, was a different kind of pain. My world, the life I thought I'd built with Claire, was splintering right in front of me. I read on, almost in a trance. Her response was just as damning. "I wish we didn't have to wait, but I'll see you soon." "Same place?" She ended the message with a little winking emoji, a touch of casualness that made the betrayal feel even sharper. I felt a sick sense of dread as I realized this wasn't a one-time thing. This was planned, rehearsed. This had been going on behind my back, maybe for months. I closed the laptop, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could hear Claire's soft breathing from upstairs, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. Part of me wanted to confront her right then, to shake her awake and demand answers. But another part of me, perhaps the calmer, more rational side, knew I needed to approach this carefully. I wanted every detail, every piece of evidence. If this was going to end, it would end on my terms. The next morning, I acted like nothing had changed. I watched her pour coffee, smiling as she talked about her plans for the day. She looked so innocent, so composed, and it made my anger simmer just below the surface. I could feel it building, but I kept my voice steady, kept my face blank, hiding the fury I was wrestling with inside. I decided that I needed to gather more evidence before confronting her. I didn't want to leave any room for denials, any chance for her to weasel her way out of the truth. So I began keeping track of her movements, noting down her work schedule, her business trips, every detail she gave me. I was careful not to let on, but each conversation felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I kept replaying those emails in my mind, each word searing itself deeper into my memory. A week passed, then 2. I had managed to find a few more emails, messages filled with coded language and plans to meet up under the guise of work. The more I uncovered, the more I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. I didn't recognize the woman I was reading about, the woman who had promised to love me, to build a life with me. The woman I had trusted so blindly. Then, one night, my patience was rewarded. Claire was getting ready for another trip, packing her suitcase with a precision that spoke of routine. I watched her from the doorway, my stomach twisting as she folded her clothes, humming softly to herself. She looked up and caught me watching, giving me a smile that felt like an insult. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone light, as if nothing in the world could be wrong. I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just thinking about how much I'm going to miss you," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. She walked over and wrapped her arms around me, pressing a quick kiss to my cheek before going back to her packing. As she turned away, I noticed her phone on the dresser. My heart pounded, my hands itching to reach out, but I waited until she went to the bathroom. When I heard the water running, I picked up her phone, my fingers trembling as I navigated to her messages. There it was. A message from Michael. "Can't wait to see you tonight," he'd written. "I'll make it worth your while." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I stared at the words, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. She had no idea that I was holding this evidence in my hands, that her betrayal was no longer hidden in the shadows. When she came out of the bathroom, I was already back in the doorway, acting as if I hadn't moved. She smiled, oblivious, gathering her things and giving me a final kiss goodbye before she left. As the door clicked shut, I felt a weight lift. I was done waiting, done pretending. It was time to confront her, to take back control of my life. I spent the rest of the evening formulating my plan, going over every possible outcome. I would confront her, yes, but I wanted more than just an apology or a half-hearted confession. I wanted her to see the damage she had done, to feel the weight of every lie, every deceitful act. And I knew exactly how I was going to make her understand. As I lay in bed that night, alone for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I was ready. The truth was out, and there was no going back. I would confront Claire, armed with everything I had uncovered, and I would watch her world crumble just as she had shattered mine. All I had to do now was wait. The following morning felt surreal. The anger simmering in me had settled into a cool resolve, a kind of calm before the storm. Claire would be back that evening, and I decided that it would be her last night under our roof. I wanted the confrontation to be as clear-cut as possible. There would be no denials, no justifications, and no pathetic pleas for forgiveness. I wanted her to see the extent of her betrayal without the cushion of excuses. While she was away, I had time to prepare. I gathered everything, the emails, the texts, and even the hotel bills I'd found on our credit card statement. I'd printed it all out, each page a testament to her deceit. By the time I'd finished, I had a small stack of evidence waiting for her, neatly bound in a folder. I didn't want to give her room for explanations or claims of misunderstanding. This was the truth, bare and irrefutable, just like the lies she'd fed me for months. That evening, I heard her car pull into the driveway, and my stomach twisted with a mixture of dread and determination. She entered the house as if everything were normal, setting her suitcase by the door and smiling at me in that familiar, comfortable way. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia, a memory of the early days of our marriage when everything seemed so honest, so right. But the feeling passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold reminder of why I'd gone to these lengths. "Hey," she said, leaning in for a kiss, which I turned into a quick hug instead. She looked at me, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "You okay?" I nodded, managing a faint smile. "Yeah, just tired," I replied. "Long day." She seemed to accept this and went about her usual routine, making herself comfortable, talking about her trip in a way that would have seemed ordinary just a few weeks ago. As she spoke, I listened, only half hearing her words, knowing that everything she was saying was just background noise. When she finished, I finally met her gaze, taking a deep breath as I set the folder on the table between us. "Claire, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady. She looked down at the folder, a hint of apprehension crossing her face. "What's this?" Just some things I found. Go ahead and open it. She hesitated, but curiosity, or maybe a guilty instinct, got the better of her. She reached for the folder, flipping it open. The color drained from her face as her eyes scanned the first page, a printed email exchange between her and Michael. I watched her expression shift from shock to horror, and then, for a split second, defiance. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling slightly, each new piece of evidence like a hammer driving the nails into her own story. When she finally closed the folder, she looked at me, her face pale and her mouth drawn into a tight line. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Then don't say anything, I replied. Just listen. She opened her mouth as if to argue, to protest, but I held up a hand, stopping her. Don't. I don't want excuses, or explanations, or some flimsy story about how you were never meant to hurt me. I'm done hearing lies. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out a hand toward me, but I took a step back. Do you know how much I trusted you, Claire? I asked, my voice steady but low. I never even thought to question you. For years, I gave you every ounce of trust, believing that we were in this together. And you threw it away. It wasn't like that, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't mean. Stop, I said sharply. Don't pretend this was anything but a choice. A choice you made again and again, every time you met him, every time you lied to me. She seemed to crumble, her shoulders sagging as the weight of her actions sank in. For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the reality of everything that had happened hanging heavy in the air. Finally, I took a step back, giving her the space to speak, if she could muster the courage. Her eyes searched mine, filled with desperation. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I know that's not enough, but it just happened. Things got out of hand. I laughed, a hollow sound that felt foreign to my ears. Out of hand? That's what you call it? Out of hand is losing track of time or forgetting an appointment. This was a calculated betrayal. She winced, the impact of my words landing with the weight of her own guilt. I don't know what to say, she stammered, finally at a loss. There's nothing to say, I replied coldly. There's nothing that can fix this. You've broken something that can't be put back together. She started to cry, her shoulders shaking as she wrapped her arms around herself, looking smaller, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. I might have felt pity if I wasn't so filled with anger and betrayal. I had given her everything, had built a life with her, and she had repaid me with lies. I want you out, Claire, I said finally, my voice calm but unwavering. I want you to pack your things and leave tonight. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, a flash of shock crossing her features. Please, don't do this, she pleaded. I know I've made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but we can work through this. We can go to counseling, we can try to rebuild. Please, don't throw this all away. I shook my head, resolute. I'm not the one who threw anything away, Claire. You did. You made this choice, and now you have to live with it. Her desperation grew, and she reached out again, as if hoping to bridge the distance between us. Please, she begged, her voice cracking. Please let me make this right. Don't do this to us. But there was no us anymore. That was the painful truth, the one I had come to accept in the long, sleepless nights leading up to this moment. Whatever we had, whatever trust and love we'd shared, had been destroyed, piece by piece, every time she chose someone else over me. I couldn't forgive that, couldn't forget it. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too profound. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of finality in my words. Claire, you have until morning to gather your things and go. This marriage is over. She sank to the floor, sobbing openly, but I didn't move to comfort her. For the first time, I felt nothing for the woman who had been my wife, the woman I had loved with every part of me. She had hollowed herself out with every lie, every deception, until there was nothing left for me to hold on to. Turning away, I walked to the doorway, pausing only briefly to look back. I hope it was worth it, Claire, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. And with that, I left her alone with the ruins of what she had destroyed. The house felt strangely silent as I walked down the hallway, as though it, too, were mourning the end of something. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I had done what I needed to do. I had faced the truth and made my choice. In the quiet darkness, I felt ready to rebuild, to start over, free from the lies and deception that had haunted me for so long. As I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, the silence of the house pressed in around me. The calm I had felt after Claire left began to give way to something colder, something hollow that seemed to settle deep within my chest. The truth was that our marriage hadn't simply ended, it had been shattered, its pieces scattered beyond repair. I should have felt relief, maybe even satisfaction, but instead, I felt an emptiness that I hadn't anticipated. A few days passed. I focused on my routine, throwing myself into work and spending time with the kids, hoping to fill the silence that now felt suffocating in Claire's absence. But her absence wasn't something I could ignore. Every corner of the house held her ghost, an echo of laughter, the faint smell of her perfume on a sweater left behind, a book she'd been reading on the nightstand. It was as if her presence lingered in every shadow, haunting me with memories I wished I could forget. One evening, a few weeks after Claire had left, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. The memories poured out, one after another: our wedding day, the kids' first birthdays, vacations, stolen moments of laughter. The Claire I saw in those photos was a stranger now, but the memories didn't let go. They wrapped around me like a vice, squeezing until I felt like I could hardly breathe. I'd lost not only my wife, but the life we'd built together, and I didn't know how to move forward. As I put the phone down, the doorbell rang, cutting through the quiet. I got up, frowning, not expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I froze. It was Claire. She looked different, smaller, as though she'd shrunk into herself. Her eyes were red, her face pale, and she wore a look of desperation that made her almost unrecognizable. She clutched a small bag in her hand, her fingers twisting nervously around the handle. "What are you doing here?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know where else to go." Her words hit me like a punch, and I felt my anger flare, but it was mixed with something else, something that softened the edges of my bitterness. I didn't respond, just stood there, waiting. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm lost. I thought I could live with what I'd done. I thought it was just a mistake. But I can't. Everywhere I go, everything I do, it's like I'm haunted by what I threw away." A part of me wanted to shut the door, to turn her away and let her carry the weight of her choices alone. But another part of me, the part that had once loved her, that had shared a life with her, couldn't look away from the pain in her eyes. I took a deep breath, stepping aside, and she walked in, her steps hesitant as though she feared the house would reject her. We sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes filled with remorse. I just needed to say, "I'm sorry. For everything. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Her apology was sincere, I could see that, but it felt like a bandage on a wound too deep to heal. "What do you expect me to do, Claire?" I asked, my voice quiet. "You tore us apart." "I know," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "And I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking. I'm asking for one more chance." The weight of her words hung in the air, and I felt torn. Every part of me wanted to say no, to tell her that her choices had destroyed everything we had. But there was a small, painful part of me that still longed for the life we had shared, the love that once seemed unbreakable. I looked away, unable to meet her gaze as I wrestled with the chaos of emotions inside me. The silence stretched between us, thick with things left unsaid. And then, as if the universe itself had intervened, the shrill ring of my phone broke the tension. I picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was the hospital. My stomach dropped as I answered, hearing the urgent voice on the other end. "Mr. Sanders, this is Dr. Patel at Charlotte Memorial. Your son, he was brought in after a car accident. He's in critical condition." My world tilted, and for a moment, I couldn't process the words. "What?" I managed to stammer, my mind struggling to catch up. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Sanders. We're doing everything we can. I suggest you get here as soon as possible." The line went dead, and I stared at the phone, my heart pounding as the reality of what I'd just heard sank in. Without a word, I grabbed my keys, barely aware that Claire was following me as I stumbled to the car, numb with shock. The drive to the hospital felt endless, my mind a blur of thoughts, fears, and prayers. I barely registered Claire's presence beside me, her hand on mine as if she could somehow absorb the fear radiating from me. When we finally arrived, we rushed inside, my breath catching as a nurse led us to the trauma ward. A doctor met us there, his face grim. "Mr. Sanders, your son suffered severe injuries. We're doing everything we can, but his condition is extremely serious." The words washed over me like a wave, and I felt my knees buckle, Claire's grip on my arm the only thing keeping me upright. I could see the grief mirrored in her eyes, the same raw pain I felt. The waiting room was a blur of white walls, sterile lights, and the hum of machinery, each minute stretching out like an eternity. Hours passed in a haze of worry and whispered prayers, the hope that our son would pull through becoming my only focus. Claire sat beside me, silent, her presence somehow comforting, though we were both broken in different ways. We didn't speak, but her hand remained on mine, a fragile connection in the midst of our shared despair. Finally, the doctor returned, his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath, looking between us, and I knew before he even spoke. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice laced with genuine sorrow. "We did everything we could." A scream built inside me, a wordless cry that tore through me as I collapsed, Claire's arms around me as I wept. Our son, our beautiful, bright boy, was gone. The weight of it crushed me, a grief so intense that I felt like I was drowning, each breath a painful reminder of the life we'd lost. In the days that followed, Claire and I drifted through the motions of planning the funeral, barely speaking, barely able to look at each other. The house that had once felt haunted by her betrayal was now filled with an even darker shadow, a loss so profound that it threatened to swallow us whole. Our marriage, already broken, felt like ash in my hands, and yet, in our shared grief, we clung to each other, the only two souls who understood the depth of what we had lost. We stood together at the graveside, the wind cold and biting, our hands joined as we watched our son's casket lower into the ground. Tears blurred my vision, and I felt Claire's grip tighten, her own silent sobs mirroring mine. In that moment, the anger, the betrayal, all of it felt insignificant in the face of our shared sorrow. That night, we returned home, each of us alone in our own way, haunted by the emptiness that filled the house. Claire's betrayal still lingered between us, an unhealed wound, but now it was dwarfed by something deeper, something that neither of us could outrun. I sat in the darkness, staring at the walls that had once held so many memories, now hollow and lifeless. Claire sat across from me, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with red. I didn't know what the future held or if we could ever find peace after the storm that had torn through our lives. But in the silence, we shared a grief that no one else could understand, a bond forged from loss. In that quiet, broken moment, I reached for her hand, and together we sat, two souls bound by the sorrow of what we had lost and the haunting knowledge that nothing could ever make us whole again.